Okay. Yeah. Hey ho.
Hey ho.
Calling Chris Anderson in Windsor.
No,
Oh, not
quite
in
to
Windsor. Oh,
Windsor.
where are you? You're small on my
I
screen. You're on the road someplace. Where are you?
I'm in Southampton.
Ah,
I have
Southampton.
a beautiful view of the harbor, and we've finished up the first day of our Band of Brothers tour, and tomorrow we're off to France. So
Oh,
I'm in
fantastic!
Southampton. But you, of
This is
course, are in Chicago.
the signature tour with you and Mr. George Luz.
Yes.
Ah, so
Yeah.
do you guys
It's a
sign
very
something
special
for your
tour.
guests? Do you like sign their arms or something? Because it's the
No, but the
signature.
hotels are a lot nicer. Yeah, the
Oh,
hotels are a
okay.
lot nicer, which we appreciate. And how are things in
Okay.
Chicago?
Things in Chicago are hot. It's 90 degrees here, and I'm staying indoors, wearing a vest, as you can see. So I'm not dealing with heat, although I am wearing shorts. So I'm not going to show that, but I will admit that I am doing that. Welcome,
Yeah,
everybody, to History Happy Hour.
because you're an old man and you're.
I am. I am an old man wearing shorts. Damn it. So welcome to History Happy Hour.
And a
Thanks
vest.
to in a vest. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on, or listening on the HHH podcast. Yeah, we're glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about American women flying for Britain in World War II. But before we get to that, let us know what you're drinking and where you are and what the weather is where you are and all that good stuff. And Chris, we should thank everybody who supports us on Patreon.
Absolutely. We
especially,
really appreciate that.
Especially our top shelf patrons. And you can join this august group by clicking on patreon.com/historyhappyhour. And again, I confess to people who've joined most recently, I haven't updated this. I'm hoping to do it next week, but I'm still dealing with a very frustrating computer failure that has prevented me from doing many things, and that is one of them.
Your post-cruise kind of aura.
And my post-cruise aura, right? So just a week ago today, we were on the ship, and now we're not. No one's bringing us free drinks anymore.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you mostly abstained from that because of your purity, but yeah. Chris, anybody out there? Anybody watching us here on this on the show?
Lots of no. We got a great crowd. We got Amanda Jo Morris from beautiful Colorado, as opposed to ugly Colorado, so she's in the nice part.
Oh, good.
Dave Borland from
Evanston, yeah,
Pennsylvania. Barry Milgate, UK. Yep. So we're international now. And Audrey from Texas, Ted Moon from Northern Virginia, and I think I saw Lizzie Borden from London there. So.
Oh, great to have Lizzie back with us. Super. Well, I think I know that Becky's standing by, so we should give me the signal and we'll get her on here.
All right. The fingers are ready.
Okay.
There
the bar is open. Yeah, yes. I had to over to get that bell because
you're finally home and you lose the bell.
I almost had no bell, but we did get the bell in. Okay, guys. Today we're going to look at the story of 25 women, American women, who flew for England, Great Britain, in World War II when they were denied the chance to fly for the United States. They became the first American women to command military aircraft. And Becky Aikman has written a book about this group entitled Spitfires, the American women who flew in the face of danger during World War II. And Becky is a former journalist at Newsday for the Times and the Los Angeles Times and other publications. And she's written 2 other books, but I think Becky said this is her first history book. So welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
So you wrote a history book and you're happy. So History Happy. Okay.
It all fits.
Yeah.
It all
fits, it's all together. I'm not sure. I know you're in Los Angeles, Becky. So you have a watered down cocktail there. So, Chris,
Sorry if I'm not meeting the spirit of the happy
I
hour.
no, you're fine. We don't force
No,
anybody to
you're
drink.
there in spirit.
Yeah, and Chris, did you?
Well,
Are
we
you?
do.
Yeah. Well, our spirits are strong.
Well, I
Um,
don't have. I don't have my Glen Turret 12, and the mini bar was sort of minimal, so I just have a white wine.
well, I like that you're doing the best you can. So Becky, the story of these women, these American women who flew as ferry pilots in Great Britain in World War II, was clearly well known at the time because you document in your book there was all sorts of newspaper coverage of them, photographs, headlines, and stuff. But this story is, I'm not going to say completely unknown, but largely unknown today. So why do you think it's been forgotten, and how did you come across it?
I think when the war was over, the world was ready to move on. And this was a small group of women who did a very extraordinary thing, but nobody seemed to make much note of it once the war was over. So they were almost completely forgotten, at least in the United States. I think in Great Britain, where ferry pilots served, they were much more admired by the public and their memories were kept alive. But in the United States, there was no social media then for them to go on Instagram. There was nothing to keep them in the public eye. And historians, I think, concentrated more on more official branches of the military. And these were women who couldn't be accepted by the Air Force during the war. And so they took this unusual path to be able to serve and able to serve as pilots of the top aircraft in the world. Now, the way I came across the story was thanks to my mother,
Oh,
who
okay.
was a young child during World War II. And I was talking to her about how I was looking for a subject for a book that would be about people who did something extraordinary, but the world didn't necessarily know about it. She immediately said, "You must write about the American women who flew in England during the war." Um, I had never heard of this. I looked around briefly on the internet, couldn't find anything about it.
So you thought your mother was, kind of making something up or
That's
misremembering?
exactly what I thought. I went back to her and said, "Are you sure you don't have this mixed up?" Polite way of saying that. And she did not like that. She said she remembered she had seen something like a newsreel or maybe Life magazine or something. And she said, "I thought they were so noble and glamorous. I wished I could do what they did." That stayed with her all her life, that she had seen these women do something so amazing at a time when women rarely had this opportunity. So I dug harder and I learned that there had been this organization in Britain that would accept women, people from other countries, to pilot all the top aircraft of the time. I contacted a museum there and spoke to the gentleman who ran it. The very first thing he said, it sounded just like my mother. He said, "I hope you don't plan to fictionalize this because nothing could be as exciting and glamorous as the reality." So I knew I had a great story on my hands if only I could dig up the information, which was largely lost.
So, Becky, why don't you tell us about this organization? So, what is the ATA? How does it come about? What do they do? Because, again, as you said, most Americans have no idea. And so that might be a good kind of baseline. So,
Yes.
what is this organization?
Well, ATA are the initials for the Air Transport Auxiliary, which is a rather mundane sounding title for a very exciting organization. Early in the war, Great Britain, as you know, was fighting all alone. They were being bombed relentlessly by the Germans every night. They desperately needed more aircraft fast and more pilots fast. So they decided to start this separate organization from the Royal Air Force that would transport aircraft from factories to airfields and transport damaged aircraft from the airfields back to be repaired. They decided to accept pilots who were maybe past the age limit for the RAF, pilots from countries around the world, pilots who had disabilities of some sort, and yes, even women. to do this job because they needed the help so much. So it was kind of a seat of the pants organization that started off without a lot of rules. Their work was extremely dangerous. It was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war because the pilots were flying these new aircraft that were coming off the factory lines without really being particularly well tested. They were flying severely damaged aircraft back, little knowing what could go wrong till they were high in the sky. And they flew without instruments in the very changeable British weather, which resulted in them flying into whiteouts and smacking into mountains or church steeples. So 1 in 7 of the pilots who served in the APA died in crashes during
Oh,
the war.
wow.
It was not a lark. So the people who chose to do it had to be really good at what they did and really brave.
So I guess the follow-up question to that, how did it get started that these American women are flying for this organization? I know it involves a woman named Jackie Cochran, but what's the impetus? Who, what, or how is for bringing them to Britain to fly as part of the ATA?
Well, Jackie Cochran was a very famous aviator in the United States during the 1930s. There she is, very glamorous and a self-made millionaire who started her own cosmetics company and went on from there to excel in aviation. She won many prominent air races. She set many records. She was widely known to the public and friends with high-level people in the United States, including the Roosevelts and General Hap Arnold, who was running the Army Air Forces at that time. She lobbied to have a woman's flying force started for the United States ahead of the war, knowing that it may come about. But she failed in that. However, she did know that Great Britain would accept women pilots, so she decided that she would lead a group of Americans to do this, and she contacted by telegram many of the top women pilots in the United States. They got this telegram out of the blue. They couldn't believe their good fortune. These were people who mostly flew little airplanes like Piper Cubs. Suddenly they would be allowed to fly the fastest fighters, the biggest bombers, the most advanced aircraft of the time if they could get this job. So they were eager to sign up.
So, Becky, I think it would be helpful too to just talk about what is the state of women in aviation at this point. Like, who are these women? What are these do? What are they doing? And how does Jackie Cochran even know how to contact them?
If Jackie Cochran wanted to do something, she got it done somehow. She was a very driven and ambitious person.
Right.
She got the records of all the women who had at least 300 flying hours from the equivalent of what the FAA was at the time and sent them these telegrams. Your other part of your question was, about the state of women flying at the time. It was very rare for women to be aircraft pilots. Many women at the time didn't even have a driver's license for a car. Those who did it were people who loved the idea of flying and would do what it took to somehow get their license. They were from a very broad range of American society. A lot of people, especially in England, who could fly, a lot of women were from very aristocratic backgrounds, and they had the money to learn to fly, and they would take their little airplane to garden parties and ski slopes. There were a couple who were like this. One of them was a debutante from one of the wealthiest families in the United States, the family of the Western Union fortune, which was the tech giant of its time. She was expected to capture a wealthy husband at a debutante ball. She was not interested in men. She was attracted to women. So that was a very awkward position for her to be in. But when she learned to fly, she saw it as an escape from this life that had been planned for her. There she is. Her name was Virginia Farr. And she was so happy when she learned to fly. Now, others were not well-to-do at all and scraped however they could to somehow get flying lessons. One of them agreed to jump out of an airplane with a parachute for an air show 3 times. And if she did, they would teach her how to fly. So she went up with no training about parachutes and did it. And this is not that person, but
Sorry. I was trying to pass the test there and get it right, but
her name was Mary Webb Nicholson, and she
Okay.
became quite a renowned stunt pilot once she got her license. There was another woman who her name was Dorothy Fury, so you can find her photograph. There she is. She came from an impoverished background in New Orleans and only had an 8th grade education. From that time, she always had a job, and she had a used Model T car, which she bartered for flying lessons and got another way to get to the airport. She is a very interesting character in the book because when they went abroad, these women could invent themselves as they pleased. No one over there knew who they really were. She was very beautiful and knew she had a tremendous effect on men. She also had a very imperious way about her, despite her humble background. So people over in England assumed she was some sort of American aristocrat. In fact, even long after the war, I saw references to her as an American heiress, when in fact she was completely poor. She brought one red dress that she recycled for every occasion, but she was determined to rise in British society, which she succeeded in doing. There was a British lord who threw a ball for the entire airfield just for the opportunity to meet her, and that resulted in scandal and led to her very high rise in British society. So there was a real mix of people, and they wanted to fly. They wanted that freedom to be in the air, but they also wanted that freedom that flying gave them to live the way they pleased, and they succeeded.
so
Us and describe, because these women are volunteering for this organization before America's in the war. It's hard for anybody to get involved. Walk us through the process. Maybe pick one of these women. Walk us through the process of getting the letter from Jackie Cochran to all of a sudden being in the cockpit of a Spitfire. How do they get there?
When they got the telegram, they were told that if they were interested in joining, first they had to meet Jackie Cochran. She would pay their way to visit her in New York, or maybe she would visit them in her airplane. She wanted to make sure that they would be good representatives for America. So she was looking for people who were kind of classy, I think. So some didn't succeed because of that. But once she approved someone, then they would go to Montreal, where they would have to go through a flight check. And the flight check was on something called the AT-6 Harvard. It was a very fast fighter trainer that was built by America and used in Great Britain to train pilots. Now, most of these women had only flown these little tiny aircraft with very few horsepower. They only had a couple hours to learn to fly this Harvard AT-6. It was something that went 200 miles an hour. It had all kinds of gizmos and gadgets that they had never seen before. They'd never used flaps, for example, on the wings to land. They had never seen all kinds of aspects of this aircraft. They had a couple hours to learn it, and then they had to fly it solo in order to be accepted by the ATA. It turned out this was the perfect test for this job because in the ATA, pilots were expected to fly up to 147 different models of aircraft with often no advance notice and just a little one-page sheet of instructions about here's how you make it go, here's how you make it stop, or whatever. So it was the perfect test. A few women did not pass the test, but those who did then boarded ships to go across the Atlantic to join up. Now, even that was a very dangerous thing in 1942. This was early 1942, when German submarines really had control of the North Atlantic, and hundreds of ships were sunk. These women went on mostly cargo ships. They were often the only women who'd ever been on board one of them, and they were taught how to get into the lifeboats if needed. They were told always sleep in your clothes because you had to be ready to run. Dorothy Fury, who never listened to what anyone wanted her to do, slept in the nude because she said her room was too hot. And if they were going to sing, she knew she'd go down anyway. So she might as well be comfortable. When they got to Liverpool, they were divided into groups, by the way. The first group was only 5 of them because they didn't want to lose all 25 at once if Marines got the ships. The first 5 who arrived made a terrible impression on the British officials who came to meet them. The Americans had been at sea for 2 weeks under very stressful conditions while they were waiting for customs. They had their own history happy hour and sort of sashayed down the gangplank in quite a state. And they were kissing members of the crew goodbye. It was all very scandalous to the head of the women's branch of the ATA, who had expected women more like herself. She was the daughter of a member of parliament. She came from a very upper crust background, and she was expecting the Americans to be better behaved, shall we say, and was surprised at how boisterous and free-thinking they were.
So I'm going to guess that my last question disappeared in the ether. Would that be correct?
I think it may have. Yes, you were cutting out a little.
Yeah, I'm going to try it again, see if the internet is editing me or if I can get it out this time. But it seems like you have a lot of detail on these women. And a lot of them apparently were writing diaries or writing extensive letters describing their innermost emotions, their flying, their affairs, their friendships, everything. And so, was there some kind of women's flying library where you found all this stuff, or how did you come up with all the background to write this?
It took me 5 years to do this book, and that is because they were not famous, and you couldn't just go somewhere and find all this stuff out. A couple of them had a sense of their importance and had donated some papers and letters to archives in a couple of museums in the United States. So I started with them. The very first one I tracked down was named Mary Zerbal. She had donated papers to the San Diego Air and Space Museum. So I went there, and it was not at all promising. When I arrived, the library said, "Oh, you're the first person who ever asked to see these." But when I opened them up, it just made her come alive to me. She had written wonderful journals and had all kinds of newspaper clippings about her because she'd been quite celebrated before the war as the youngest woman flying instructor in the United States at the age of 19. She was also very pretty, so the newspapers loved to take her picture posing on the wings of aircraft. She was also famous during the war because she and her fiancé became the first 2 Americans serving in the war to marry in the war zone, and newspapers got wind of it, and it was covered throughout the world. Even after the war, she had a very exciting career, to the extent that after the war, a movie was made based on her life, starring Lana Turner. It was called Lady Takes a Flyer.
Wow.
Wow. How do people not know about this? When I got to the last page of the file, it was her obituary. It ran in the Pocatello, Idaho newspaper. It was 3 sentences long, and it didn't even mention that she knew how to fly. So that's how she went from being so celebrated to being completely forgotten. And I vowed at that point, if they were all this interesting, I had to keep going, and I had to bring these stories back to the public. So there were 1 or 2 others who had left papers that I could use. It was during COVID, so they limited how much I could get at a time because they were closed. So often they would leave me off in the middle of some huge drama and I wouldn't know what would happen. It would be months before I could get more. But I also tracked down family members of the pilots. And that's where I really hit pay dirt. It was really hard to find a lot of them. I remember looking for one whose name was Ann Smith. I just cold called Ann Smiths all across the country, asking if any member of their family had ever flown in Britain. But eventually I did find a number of them, and they went into their attics and brought out these diaries and letters and other very personal things. that no one outside their families had ever seen before. And they were thrilled at the thought that somebody would finally make something of this. So they would all send me this information. And it helped me really learn to know these women in such an intimate way and get so many details of their dramatic flying escapades and their feelings and emotions throughout being in a foreign land during a war. So I was really fortunate that I was able to get so much that I could make the story as personal as I could. And so it reads more like a novel, really. You're following these
Yeah.
characters.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I was just in the British Archives on Thursday researching Chris's favorite topic, the Ghost Army, and which I have written about and done a lot of research
Ad
into. Sorry,
nauseam.
Chris. Yeah. But there is such joy in a discovery in the archives, right? I mean, there is this when you go in and you're not sure, oh, is this going to be the thing? I don't know. I'm filling out the slips. I'm waiting to come out. And then something comes out, or it's a family and they send you something and you just light up when you realize that you've got storytelling gold in front of you. And I'm going to predict to you, Becky, that for the next 10 years, you're going to have other family members from time to time suddenly pop up on the radar and say, oh, well, somebody's interested in this. You don't know about my Aunt Lizzie's diary or my mother Mary Jo's experiences. You know, you're gonna be living with this for a long time, I think.
Well, it's already happened. People who've gotten in touch with me about some of the pilots who did not become major characters in the book. And that's partly because I knew readers could only follow so many people.
Sure.
So some of them have actually contacted me to see what I know about their family members to share with them that may not have wound up in the book. But I think, yes, many people would like me to write a new version, adding their families more to it. But I think I put in as much as I could without making it too hard to follow for people. But I did definitely give more attention to those who did leave behind their thoughts because I was able to create fuller characters of those than some who I do know existed, but I don't know what their ambitions were or what their feelings were.
Chris, are you there?
Yeah. So Becky, yeah, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, I could hear you.
I think he froze.
I think we've lost Chris.
I wanted to pose a question, and I'm going to try to do this. And Cheryl Holt wants to know: were these women accepted or respected by the male pilots they flew with?
Yeah, that's a good question because in the United States, eventually they started the WASP based on the success of these women in Great Britain. And they went through some pretty hard times and were not very well respected. The women who went to Great Britain had a much better experience. The country was in the midst of being under attack, and they were really grateful that people from a foreign country would come and help them out and do this dangerous, daring work. So for the most part, the American women were treated quite well. They were well paid. Shortly after, well, about a year after their arrival, the British Parliament passed the very first Equal Pay Act only for the women ATA pilots because they recognized they were doing exactly what the men were doing, and it was hard and dangerous. It was decades before any other groups got this kind of recognition. So something about the nature of the work they were doing, that it was so dangerous, that it took so much skill, they really did get a lot of respect. There were a few incidents here and there where somebody might make a remark like, who are you to fly this? But it was usually somebody who couldn't fly it themselves either. So the women really laughed it off when those things happened.
Well, you had a line from this woman that might be worth repeating here.
Yes, I love this. This woman was named Joan Hughes, and she was a British woman who flew. And there she is under a Lancaster bomber. You can see the height differential very clearly. Um, Occasionally, people would say, "Aren't you too small to fly these big aircraft?" And she would say, "The idea is for the plane to lift me, not for me to lift the plane."
Right. Well said.
So they
Well
had the
said.
skill. They didn't need physical strength. They needed the courage and the skill, and they had it.
So many of these women are living a life that doesn't feel very 1940s when you read about it. Um, they're having sexual adventures. They're doing other stuff kind of on their own. There's a strong sense of have fun today because tomorrow we may die. Why was it important for you to include this in the book?
Hmm. Well, I think it gives a full picture of what this experience was like. I could have written a book that was only about their flying adventures, and that would have been very exciting also. But I think one thing I loved about the story was that this opportunity to do this important work in the war enabled them to live the way women live today. And I thought it was pretty interesting for people to know that women could behave that way back in the 1940s. We like to think that women doing as they pleased was something invented in the last few decades, but in fact, they were doing it then. I thought it was a key part of the entire story that doing important work can allow a woman to live as she pleases in other ways.
So, one of our viewers, Frank Cook, asks, did any of these women pilots become casualties of the war? I mean, it was a dangerous business. You pointed out 1 out of 7 of the overall ATA pilots passed away. But did any of the American women that you came across, did they pass away in the war?
Yes, some had to leave due to severe injuries, and one of the American women was killed in a pretty classic ATA accident. She took off on a brand new fighter trainer that had just come off an assembly line. When she was 1,000 feet in the air, there was an oil leak that caused the propeller to seize up. That caused the propeller to fall off the aircraft and fall 1,000 feet to the farming fields below. She had few options what to do. Um, no one had really reconstructed exactly what happened to this, but I used the records and I had a team of historic aviation enthusiasts who would advise me on what would happen in these circumstances so I could reconstruct it. And what we concluded was that she was flying directly toward a city and she turned in order not to kill civilians on the ground. She looked for a field that was long enough and flat enough to glide down and get onto the ground in one piece. The best field she could find was not long enough, and it had apple trees strewn throughout. I was able to talk to eyewitnesses who were young children at the time who saw her plane come down. Uh, she was not able to stop short of the end of the field. She hit a barn, the plane exploded, and she was killed instantly. Now, many of her colleagues concluded that, oh, she could have got it down on the ground had she done something differently, which always upset her family. But in reconstructing the accident, it was clear that there was nothing better she could have done. One of the pilots said, oh, she was religious. She must have closed her eyes and prayed, and that's why she hit the barn. But I did speak to a gentleman who was a little boy at the time, who was only 20 feet away as the aircraft was coming down. He ran out toward it. He said she looked right at him. Then she looked again straight ahead with great determination and continued until the crash. So it was very clear that she was actively flying that aircraft till the end. She was not closing her eyes, and there was nothing better she could have done. And this is why this job was so dangerous. There just weren't options sometimes for these pilots to save themselves. Now, a couple of my pilots did managed to make spectacular saves that many people felt few pilots would be able to pull off. But a couple of the women I wrote about were stunt pilots back home, and they had been in crazy situations as stunt pilots, doing spins and loops and things, and some of them were able to save their lives when they were in terrible straits when their aircraft failed in England, and somehow still managed to get onto the ground in one piece.
Excellent.
So Becky, I'm going to read a passage here, and this is from Hazel Raines, who is one of the pilots, and she says,
I'm waiting with bated breath.
Me too.
Man, still carrying on with that true American spirit of it can't happen to us. We're going to England.
Maybe, Becky, we're having trouble hearing what Chris is saying, but I'll bet you know this passage that he's talking about. So,
She wrote this passage in a letter to her mother on her trip across the North Atlantic. I believe that's the one you're reading.
Right. So, yeah, and you describe these women as glamorous, and people are following them, and they write all these stories. But talk about, do these women have a sense of A, what they're volunteering for, why they're in the fight?
give it your best shot, Becky.
Yeah, I can talk about it. Yes, we talked about some of their more frivolous reasons, but they all wanted to contribute to an Allied victory, and they wanted to do the most they could possibly do, given the skill that they had. So that is why they signed up. Hazel Raines, whose passage you were reading there, had been described in a local newspaper as local. The headline was "Local Girl Flying Instructor Wants to Fly Bombers Despite Male Snickers." When she went to England, no one was snickering anymore, and she did get to fly these aircraft. She wanted to contribute. Hazel, in particular, wanted to serve in the military, and ultimately, after the war, she did join the Air Force, although she was not allowed to fly, but she did become an officer in the Air Force. So yes, they wanted to do as much as they could. And ATA pilots were frequently in circumstances where the weather was bad or there were other reasons why they shouldn't take off. Most of these women wanted to take off no matter what. They wanted to complete as many missions as they could. They wanted to accomplish what they were there to do. So they were really tough about it and tended to have really steady nerves, which allowed them to fly into bad weather and fly aircraft that had doors missing and bullet holes shooting everything up. So yeah, they were really brave and they believed in what they were doing.
So, obviously, you didn't get to meet most of these women because they passed away before you started working on the book. But amazingly, you did meet one, or at least talk to her. And amazingly, she is still alive today. So you got to tell us a little bit about her and about that.
Her name was Nancy Miller. She was from Los Angeles. She was very young when she joined. She was a minister's daughter and very clean living, unlike the others. She did not have boyfriends and she never drank alcohol. She was determined to accomplish as much as she possibly could during the war and devoted all of her efforts to that. In the evenings when the others went out to the pubs, she would read aviation magazines to be up to speed on all the latest aircraft. Today she's 106. All that clean living paid off. She was one of the most accomplished pilots. She flew clear to the end of the war, flew a very large number of aircraft. she would ask for transfers to some of the worst possible airfields with terrible weather and mountainous topography, just so she could try out new aircraft and have more and more on her list of what she was able to fly. Because after the war, she really wanted to continue to be a pilot, and she wanted to have the kind of record that could not be denied when the war was over. When it did end, no U.S. airline would hire a woman pilot, and the U.S. military still would not hire women pilots. Nancy wound up working for a flying school in Oregon, where part of her job was cleaning the bathrooms. But in her free time, she learned to fly helicopters. She became only the second woman in the United States to receive a commercial helicopter pilot's license. She and her husband moved to Alaska and started the first helicopter charter company in Alaska, which wound up having a large fleet of helicopters, all of which she flew, taking mountain climbers to mountains, taking people to the Alaska pipeline, became very successful. So she did wind up having the flexibility and resources to still remain a pilot by coming up with an innovative way to do it. I did have the great pleasure of being able to speak with her. She remembers the war as the highlight of her life, as all of the women did, because they just had this moment of achieving what we all know is true happiness, which is doing something you're good at to the maximum of your ability for a good cause. They all look back at the war as the highlight of their lives, and she still loves to talk about it today.
Wow. And it wasn't, Chris, you were saying there's just a article that Becky, you were involved with about her in the Guardian in the UK.
Yes. Her 106th birthday was a week or so ago. And
Wow.
So I let the Guardian know about it, and they did go and attend her birthday party, which was a real blast, and write an article about it. And partly I wanted that to happen because of my original goal, which is that people need to know about what these women did. So
Right.
this was an opportunity to get that to happen.
Yeah. So, Becky, kind of picking up on that idea, during the war, how much coverage are these women getting in the United States? Right? Do people know who they are and what they're doing?
Yes, there was a fair amount of coverage of them during the war. They were in Life magazine. Eleanor Roosevelt came over and did a photo op with them at the airfield because she wanted to promote the idea that women were capable of flying. Many newspapers covered their exploits. They would often be on radio shows from London where they would speak and people in the United States could listen to them. So they were quite well known at the time. And they came back on leave once or sometimes twice and were usually interviewed by the local newspapers when that happened. This all gave me good information that was very helpful because I would find these old newspaper articles. But after the war, there was very, very little coverage of them, even though some of them were resourceful enough to find ways to continue flying, but they got very little attention for it. Jackie Cochran, who we started off with, became the first woman to break the sound barrier in a jet. So she
and
was
then
always,
did Mach 2. I thought that was, she kept at it.
Yes, she did.
Well, this is kind of a question, really sort of a during the war question. You've touched on this, but just maybe a little bit more information on it. Lynn Hargrove asks if the U.S. women flying for the U.K. have an effect on women flying in the U.S. Now, Jackie Cochran comes back to the U.S. and she's involved with other people in setting up the WASP. But maybe you can answer Lynn's question and also touch on the differences, because it feels like it's a very different organization than the one you're writing about in your book.
Yes. Jackie Cochran's original goal, as we may remember, was to start a women's flying force in the U.S. So when she was in England, she spent most of her time documenting the success of these women pilots, much to the annoyance of the British, who wanted Jackie to fly herself. all of their top people flew missions like everyone else, and she was more there to continue her lobbying efforts. She left by September 1942 and went back home because she did have success in getting the U.S. to start the WASP, Women's Air Force Service Pilots. She helped to run the WASP throughout the war. The WASP was very different, partly because the attitude in the United States was much more hostile to the idea of women flying. There was always a lot of objection to the WASP. And in fact, it was ended in 1944 while the war was still raging because there was so much public objection to the idea that women might take jobs away from male pilots after the war. So some of the women who went to Britain came back and flew for the WASP, so they were sort of out of work, while the ones who stayed in Britain were able to keep working. So those who stayed, and that was most of them, recognized that they were in this very freewheeling organization where they got to call the shots a lot, and they didn't want to go back to the more restrictive policies of the WASP, where they lived in barracks, they had to do marching, they weren't trained to fly as many different aircraft. They would sometimes be assigned to target towing, which was just going back and forth with a target behind them so that soldiers in training could shoot at it. It was not that excitement, that feeling of being in the middle of the war zone and really contributing to the war itself. The Americans in the ATA were very much a part of preparations for D-Day. They were very much a part of helping to turn the tide in the Battle of the Bulge. They felt that they were having a real impact with what they were doing. And of course, the WASP also were, but it wasn't as visceral. It wasn't as much that they felt they were right in the thick of it.
You talk about, in the beginning of the book, there's a little bit of confrontation or agitation when these Americans come because they're just so boisterous and different from what is expected. Does that relationship change? Do the British accept that? And what struck me was the ATA is such an international organization, right? You have people from all over. How do they all end up getting along, or do they?
Yes, I mentioned before how the Americans made a really bad impression at the beginning, and they were really young women, and when they weren't flying, they had a lot of energy. They would go out drinking, having love affairs, and the British women were scandalized by them. Eventually, the Americans realized they'd made this poor first impression and knew that if they wanted to succeed, they would have to prove themselves in the air, which is what eventually happened. One of the earliest incidents of that was Winnowell Pierce. I don't think we've shown her photograph yet. She was probably the leader of those who were the wilder ones. She loved to party. She liked to have romances. The British thought her rather silly, but she was a very determined pilot with a fair amount of experience, even though she was, like all of them, only in her early 20s. One of her first missions was when she learned to fly fighters, which was just in the beginning of July in 1942. It was only her third ferrying mission with a Hurricane fighter, which was a very powerful and fast fighter. She took off from an airfield in a brand new one, and almost immediately after takeoff, the engine failed. Now, this is regarded as one of the most dangerous things that can happen to any pilot anywhere, and one of the most likely to be fatal. That's because you're not high enough in the sky to find a way to get down to the ground and glide. You haven't developed enough speed yet to get the aircraft to go anywhere you want while gliding. They had orders in the ATA that if this happened to you, you were supposed to just aim straight ahead and crash. It was your best chance of surviving. But she knew there were houses up ahead. She only had a split second to decide what to do. And being who she was, someone who didn't like to follow rules, she decided immediately to break the rules and try to turn around and get the Hurricane back to the airfield. It's something pilots refer to as the impossible turn. because it's almost impossible at such a low speed and a low altitude to make that turn, judge all the permutations of the wind and directions and everything, and somehow get it back onto the field. Her hands were shaking, but she somehow got it turned around. She hit the runway, no damage to herself or the aircraft. Everyone at the airfield was watching this whole thing, expecting her immediate death. They were shocked that she made it, and they had to grudgingly acknowledge that she had to be respected as a pilot. Some of my advisors on this book said it was like Captain Sullenberger, who landed that aircraft in the Hudson River. It was something very few people could pull off. This was the day before her computers would help you judge what to do. She instinctively did it and pulled it off. And she, throughout the war, despite her many shenanigans outside of the airfields, had a very successful record in her flying. So a lot of the Americans did really impress the British with their work ethic and their skill. And eventually they became some of the most admired and popular pilots in the war over there.
You have a quote from the end of the book. So as you mentioned, the pilots really didn't get together again until a bunch of them got together 35 years after the war. And one of the pilots described themselves at that point, I think it was Roberto Sanchez, as the thin edge of the wedge. And what does that mean? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I love that quote. It meant that it took a lot for women to work their way into this kind of work. And they were that thin opening that first tried to do it. I think if they had been better remembered, it would have helped women later more when people would say, oh, women flying, what a bad idea. People have just forgotten that they flew in this incredible job. I think any pilots who can fly up to 147 different aircraft under terrible conditions, they had to be the best pilots in the world. The pilots who were in the regular air forces would be trained to fly one, maybe two different kinds of aircraft. These were people whose flying ability and instincts were so exceptional that they could fly anything that was handed to them under any circumstances. So I think had they been better known, they would have been a thicker edge of the wedge. But I think many women pilots from this time on, once they know about them, will recognize how important their work was. And not just for women pilots. I mean, for anybody who's trying to do any kind of job where people say, oh, you're probably not the best qualified to do this job. I think this story is a great example that people with talent and ambition can do many things, whether people think they can or not.
Well, Chris, did you want
to? I have a question from Kachel, and they want to know, was it very difficult to get information on the women? How did you overcome the brick walls? Mm-hmm. How did you develop the story?
It was very difficult because they were not well known. Usually if you write a book about somebody who's done something amazing, you can go to many resources of things that have been written about them or things that have been saved in museums. I didn't have that luxury because they were so little known. But once again, the families were a huge help. And I didn't hit many brick walls with the families. Sometimes when you're doing reporting on a subject, people would say, oh, I don't want you talking about this, or I don't want to give you this information. They were all so excited because all their lives, these children, nieces and nephews had said, why has my mother or my aunt not been recognized for being such a pioneer? So they were thrilled and wanted to help. So I didn't hit brick walls that way, luckily. I did hit a brick wall because of COVID, because I couldn't get into Great Britain for a year and a half, where a lot of records were that I needed. So that slowed me down quite a bit. When I got there, then I was finally able to piece together some of the details, because a lot of the women didn't necessarily put dates on when things happened or say where something happened. A lot of the letters weren't allowed to give details of their missions. So going over to Britain, the records weren't wonderful. They were pretty skimpy, but they at least gave me dates and locations that helped me put the story together so it would make more sense.
Well, Becky Aikman, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to chat about your book, which is called Spitfires. And it's a great story about these women and lots of detail that we haven't gone over. So I know some people have already said they purchased the book, but I definitely think a worthwhile book to take a look at. And thank you so much for spending the time. I apologize for our technical problems along the way, but I think it was well worth it to stick with us.
Well, it's kind of like being in the ATA. Things can go wrong and you just have to cope.
Well
Becky,
done.
we had a lot of viewers that saw through it, and yeah, well done, and we appreciate it. And yeah, like Rick said, a lot of people have already said they've ordered the book. So if you haven't, do.
Well, thanks, guys. It was so much fun talking to you.
Well, thank you so much.
Good, thank you.
And Chris, you have to be someplace else next week. You just can't stay in that hotel room for a week because the Wi-Fi is not good enough.
Well, no, because I'm going to be. What? Maybe it's you. It might not be me. It might be you.
No! I was.
was
Well, I
that
did drop out once. So we both had our problems. Okay. Next week, Chris, we will
But
talk.
I will be someplace else. I promise I will be someplace else.
Okay, fair enough. I'm just looking to see if I have the book. I do. Hang on. Next week, we're going to be talking to fellow Stephen Ambrose Tours historian Jonathan Carroll, and I hope this is his book that I'm holding up, and I think it is. Beyond Black Hawk Down, Intervention, Nation Building, and Insurgency in Somalia, 1922 to 1995. If you've been on tour with Jonathan, he probably doesn't talk about this much, but we'll be talking about it with him on History Happy Hour. So that's coming up next week. And yeah. And no comments about Jonathan? Did you?
Well, no, well, now that I've caught up, no, it's a lot of my comfort zone because we're post World War II, so this is all new to me. But I'm looking forward to it. Black Hawk Down is one of my favorite books, so when Jonathan wrote this one, I was very anxious to dive into it.
And it just came out this week. So we're really looking forward to having him on with this new book. Guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Be safe.